think there's just a natural affinity there. There's no question that scientists are looking out for the future. They're trying to inform policy with evidence. And all that Greta and her colleagues in the youth movement are saying is just pay attention to the evidence. It's right there before you. So, yeah, you could call it an alliance. I think it's maybe just humanity, right? This is how we operate. It's how we always used to operate. And there's this sort of oddly monolithic denial structure out there. And at the head of the column, you've got people like Donald Trump and the PM in Australia. But they're badly misinformed, and they are not working in the public interest, and so they need to go. But unfortunately, truth has been a casualty. Science has been a casualty. We really need to restore those democratic values that upon which we rest good evidence-based decision making. So, absolutely, I think the youth movement has helped put wind in the sails of scientists out there, and vice versa. But of course, it's going to take movement building in other parts of society, and that's one of the reasons that things like the Green New Deal approach, where you talk about a just transition away from fossil fuels, so that if people see that their lives will improve, then you get new alliances. You have labor on board, for example, and you have businesses that rely on fresh water or clean air on board. We certainly have a lot of municipalities, cities, states, counties in the U.S. who are 100% on board. And even in Madrid, we're saying, hey, look, we're still in. The federal government in the U.S. obviously is sitting this one out. But if you count up the states that have made climate commitments well above and beyond Paris, that would be one of the largest countries in the world. So there's some good news out there. It's just that the international negotiation apparatus is always slow. It's always behind the times. But boy, it can flip when the time comes. And that's what happened in Paris, and I think it could happen even next year in Scotland, in Glasgow. So, yeah, I don't like to get overwhelmed by all the bad news of the day. I think there's an opportunity here to lean in and make it happen. Lots of new alliances coming down the pike, I think.
Well, at the risk of returning to bad news, I did want to talk a little bit more about Interior Secretary David Burnett, who, as I was saying earlier, might well be worse. I think he is worse than Ryan Zinke by leaps and bounds.
I agree.
But he's trying to relocate the Bureau of Land Management headquarters from Washington to several western states. And most people see it as an obvious attempt to weaken the BLM. And I believe, didn't he put a lawyer in charge who worked against public lands, who's just spent his entire career?
Yeah.
Tell me about that guy, because it's one of the worst examples of putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank, as far as I can see.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. This guy, William Penley, has always been a very vocal opponent of public lands in general, right? He never felt there should be such a thing, and that companies should have free reign to operate on these lands that are the federal estate that we all own here in the U.S. That includes all of our national monuments, our national parks, our conservation areas, all those big grasslands and mountain ranges. This is a guy who's saying, give that stuff away to the highest bidder. And it's one of the things that makes this country so special is this huge public lands estate out there. Of course, this guy doesn't want it to be public, and Secretary Bernhardt feels the same way. So he hired this guy to lead the Bureau of Land Management, which is responsible for a balanced use of those public lands. So here you have a guy who doesn't believe in public lands being put in charge of public lands. So it's the epitome of their efforts to hollow out the agency, because frankly they can hire very incapable, incompetent people and they still win, because it diminishes the public trust in the institution, which is really their goal, right? Is they don't like government, and so they're trying to hobble it. And even if they do a rotten job, it diminishes public trust. And even if they show such horrible ethics and integrity problems, it again diminishes public trust. So by being horrible, they're still achieving their goals. It's a mess. It's a real problem. And Bernhardt, it's almost as though these guys have been learning over the last decades how to get away with stuff, not how to serve the public, but how to get away with gutting these agencies, which is it's become more and more apparent, and it's appalling.
But Congress can do, surely they can restrain Bernard and, what's the name of this guy again, the new head of the BLM?
Pendley.
Pendley, right. Pendley, obviously moving the Bureau of Land Management away from Washington's headquarters out to the west, so people can't uproot their families, etc. It's clearly a naked attempt to weaken the BLM. But the Congress does control the BLM's budget, and the funding deadline was a couple of days ago, December the 20th. So what leverage does the Congress have to stop this rape of public lands and this violation of the public trust when you've got, these industry guys dedicated to undoing the very mission of the agency they're in charge of?
You raise an interesting question, because we're only slowly learning what are the consequences when an agency defies Congress. What can be done? We're seeing that also with with the impeachment proceedings and the White House not sending witnesses. It's for the most part unprecedented. So there are a couple levers that Congress can pull on the budget side. That could work. But there is still very little evidence that the agency will change its behavior. Thus far, they've not done so. Even when hauled up before the Appropriations Committee, which is the budget committee in Congress, they have not been forthcoming with information. They've misled members of Congress, and they've not followed up as promised on certain things. And it's happening certainly in the public eye, but there are lots and lots of examples below the radar where they're continuing to do that. They're not spending money on things that Congress has provided them money for, and they're spending money on things that Congress is very skeptical of. So what we're seeing is a real test of the separation of these two branches of government in the U.S., and we're seeing that certainly with the Justice Department as well in the impeachment proceedings. So we'll see how this goes. It's a real test of the democratic structures that we have set up here.
Well, Joel Clement, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
You bet, Ian. Thanks for having me on.
And again, I've been speaking with Joel Clement, who's an Arctic Initiative Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Previously, he served as Director of the Office of Policy Analysis within the United States Department of Interior, and under Secretary Ryan Zinke, Mr. Clement and dozens of his colleagues were reassigned to different positions for which they were frequently ill-suited. Mr. Clement was no longer able to work on climate policy to benefit vulnerable populations, and he first blew the whistle on his politically motivated reassignment in the Washington Post and later resigned. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon and engineer D'Angelo Jones. This program is available at backgroundbriefing.org, where you can bookmark it, sign up for email updates, as well as subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy this program, make sure you rate and review us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and SoundCloud. And be sure to share the program with friends, family, and colleagues on Twitter and Facebook at Ian Masters Media.